welcome to this video. So let's get started on making something a little bit more interesting than just a basic cube. So to begin with, I've got a fresh scene open here. So I'm going to jump over to the not the modeling room, the sculpting room, and go to geometry, edit scene, and I'm going to change my scene scale to 100 and click OK. Now I go over the reasons for that in the previous video, so check that one out and it all will be revealed. So back to the modeling room. Okay, so we've got our grid and we just need to understand the size of this grid. So let's just make sure we understand the scale. Hit spacebar, 3D primitives, and change the 3D primitive to a cube. Leave all this as default and say apply. Alright, so just choose our select again. So we just need to understand the relationship here between this grid and our objects. To do that, we'll use the measure tool. Change the unit to meters. Just drag that out a little bit. Make sure you've got your orthographic orthographic view on there, and we'll place this in the orthographic view and just use the measure tool and drag across. Hold shift bar down to constrain it to the axis, and you can see there that we've got a distance of 1 meter. Okay, so the cube dimension is 1 meter. So that means, as you can see here, that two of these smaller units here give me the 1 meter dimension, so each one being 0.5, of course. So each of these dark lines represents our 1 meter scale. All right, so that gives us some information about our grid size. When I brought the cube into the scene, you'll notice here it says polygroup 1. So it's just a sort of default name, so I don't really like that, so I'm going to call it cube reference. And if I toggle this little icon here, eyeball, it will just turn that on and off for me, so it can be there if I need it in the future. Okay, a couple of other things before we start the actual modeling. Jump over to view here, and you can see here that I've got show grid 3D on, which is basically this grid here, and also I've got snap to 3D grid on as well, and I've set up two keyboard shortcuts for that: Control G for the grid and Control Alt G for the grid snapping. And to do that, all you need to do is hover over the menu item like I'm doing here, and then hit the end key and set up your keyboard shortcuts. And you can copy off what I've done there as well. You shouldn't have any conflicts with that keyboard setup. Okay, so for now I'm just going to turn off grid snap. And the next thing to do on here is to bring in a reference object other than the cube. So I've got my cube, which helped me with the grid scale, but now I want something to help me in terms of kind of like a human figure. So to do that, I've got a reference object that I've purchased from 1024, which was an architectural visualization figure, and I've decimated that one down. So I'm going to drag that object into the scene. So this is the object, it's just an OBJ file. So I'll drag that object into my scene here, and I'm going to import it as a sculpt and painting or reference object. And there it is. So if I just zoom in on this object here and hit W on the keyboard for wireframe, you can see that it's a heavily decimated figure. Whoops, I've still got this option open there. Let's just close that down. Yeah, it's a heavily decimated figure, but that's fine for what I need. So hit W to bring back shaded mode. Right, so what size is this figure? Well, we should have roughly a human figure size in meters. It's about 1.7 meters, roughly. So let's again measure this object. So I'll hit the measure tool again and click and drag up. It's just over 1.7. It'll do. It's kind of 1.8. He might be a very tall guy. So my figure reference here is 1.8 meters, and I've also got my cube reference here, which I know is 1 meter. Okay, so that's going to help me now to understand a little bit better my scene and how tall objects are, how thick the walls are, and so on and so forth. Right, let's get rid of that measurement. Don't need that anymore. One thing that might be confusing, you notice when I brought the object in, it didn't bring it in as a polygroup reference object as it did with the cube. Instead, in the sculpt tree, it's brought it in down here as a surface object. And if let's just hide the cube for now, and I go down here to where it says male viz decimated. If I turn that one on and off, you can see that this reference object, similar to that one, but it's in a different location. So it can be a little bit confusing as to why it wasn't placed in there. It's a different type of object, and 3D-Coat sees it because I brought it in as basically a kind of a sculpt reference hybrid. Let's recap. I've got my cube, 1 meter, and I've got my figure at roughly 1.8 meters high. So now I've got all the things I need to make a start with our modeling project, which is going to be a kind of a small temple object, and our figure is going to be looking around inside that temple. Let's hide our reference just for now. We don't actually need it. And under the Polygroups tab here, I'm going to add a new layer by hitting this little plus icon. So my reference is on its own layer, and that's been turned off. So all the objects that I create from now on are going to be on this layer and any other layers that I decide to add. So we'll hit our spacebar and choose a 2D primitive this time. So we could use 3D primitives if we want to, but let's use as many tools as we can in here just to see what each of them do. So let's hit 2D primitive, and the 2D primitive is placed in there. You see I've got different options here that I can choose from in terms of shapes. But this is coming at the wrong orientation. It's kind of like upright, and I want it flat on the ground. So I will just snap to my side view here, and what I want to do is just flip this over onto its back. So what I do is I use the gizmo here, and you can see these little rotation handles on the sides. These are the directional arrows going along the axis, and this one is a rotational value here. If I hit it with the left mouse and hit space with the mouse pressed down, I get a little dialog box. And there I can enter the value I want it to rotate at, in this case 90 degrees. So once I've done that, you can see now that the object is now on its back and flat on the plane. I've currently got a subdivision count of 1, which is subdividing my plane into 4, which I don't want. So I'm going to take that off, which will give me a single polygon. Now, the other thing is, which is quite interesting, is this number here, 0.3. This represents what's called a side. Now, this is quite confusing. I don't really understand why it's called side, but to understand what this does, if you go to with the gizmo active, if you go to the center little cube here, which is our scale cube, you can see that that affects the side. value here. So in my opinion, this should be called scale, but it's called side, so go figure. At this point, let's understand what this value is then. So when it comes in, it's kind of set to 0.3, I believe, something like that. If I scale this up here and increase this figure here, and let's say I set this to 1, you can see the side value here represents roughly 2 meters, because we know our grid size is 1 meter. Okay, so 1 value in here represents 2 on my grid. Now I want this base object here to be 10 meters, so I'm just going to put in 5 to increase that size, and there we go. So just counting down, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 units, which make up our base. So at this point, I'm good to go. Everything's okay so far, so let's hit apply. And there you go, it's placed that polygon now, that 10 meter scaled object on this layer. And if I turn that one off, you can see it turns it on and off. The reason you can see that ghosting underneath is because my primitive tool is still active, so that's the active tool beneath it. If I change that to select and toggle this one on and off, there's my base object. I need to now start giving it some volume. We've mentioned before about our grid, and we know what our grid size is, but if you notice that from this angle axis, I can obviously measure things quite easily, but from this angle I don't have any grid reference, so measuring any volume in this object is going to be quite tricky in terms of accuracy. To help me with that, if you go to the View menu here, you can see here Grid Placement, and currently ZX plane is active, meaning the grid that we can see in front of us. If I add a second plane, the XY plane, you'll notice that I now have a new plane, which is going to help me for any height measurements. One of the reasons I use this keyboard shortcut for showing the 3D grid, like this view for example, is a little bit confusing, so I can just literally just use my keyboard shortcut to turn that on and off, and then snap it to the view, ready for my next extrusion or whatever. Okay, so let's just turn that grid off for now and get back to this polygon. So when I'm modeling this polygon now, I don't really want to be working on the whole object because of the temple kind of design that we're going to be making here. I can pretty much work on one half and mirror the other half over. So what I want to do is I want to just split this polygon now down the axis, and one of the things that I could use here is the split rings tool here, and you can see it's trying to give me an indication of where to split this object. So if I go to this axis here, and I can split this polygon down the center. So in order to do that, I can sort of manually try and eyeball it, but if that's a little bit difficult, I can hit the space bar, and you can see here that I was very close for 0.49. That needs to be exactly in the center, so we'll give it a value of 0.5. And now it splits that polygon down the center. And then I'm free to now delete this polygon on the other side. So I'll hit spacebar, select, and choose faces. Select the face I want to delete and hit delete on the keyboard. So now I've got half of the base left. So to mirror this over to the other side, what I need to do now is go to the Symmetry tab and press symmetry, or S on the keyboard. So with the symmetry enabled, you see nothing's actually showing at the moment because I haven't actually enabled an axis for it to work on. So I'm going to click on the X-axis, and when you click on that, you can see this little indicator here, this symmetry plane, shows me the axis of symmetry, meaning that it will flip this polygon over to the opposite side of that symmetry plane. So with it active, you can have a visual reference of where that symmetry plane is, but if you hit S on the keyboard and hit show symmetry plane and toggle it off, then it will disappear, so it's a little bit less visual noise. So at this point I'm good to go. So just double check, I've got my X-axis on symmetry and it's enabled. So if I go over now to the mesh option here and choose virtual mirror mode, you'll see that it flips this over to the other side. But this isn't real geometry on this side, it's just a virtual representation of what's on this side. So that's going to be useful for me just to check silhouettes and design and making sure it's working without actually committing to anything at this stage. Let's give this polygon a little bit more depth now and some volume. So we will again select the faces tool here and just select the face, and I will choose select and transform by holding down spacebar and choosing that tool. You can also find it at the top here. So here's where my grid comes in handy, because now I can go back and I can make sure that I show the grid and also make sure that I've got snap to 3D grid on. The polygon is still selected even though we can't see, because I know that because this gizmo is still visible. So with that visible, I'm going to hit commit extrusion, and let's make sure that my grid placement is set on there. Let's go to this side. There we go. So I can see that in this axis. And then I will, after I've committed the extrusion, I've got a face here that's ready to be extruded. It's still pretty much on top of the other one, but it's ready for me to actually extrude this one up. So if I do that now with my grid snap on, you'll see that I extrude the face upwards towards the 1/2 meter mark. So that gives me a 1/2 meter depth for my base, which is exactly what I'm after. So that's good. So let's apply that. Go back to my selection tool, and I'll go Control D to deselect, and I'll just turn off the symmetry just for a second. Now, this is one of the issues that we've got with symmetry. And let's just turn the grid off just so it's clearer. You can see that when I extruded this object up, it put a face in the center here. And I don't really want that face, so I'm going to have to delete it because I'm mirroring over and I don't want any manifold geometry inside here. So I need to get rid of this face. To do that, again, make sure you can select the face. You can hit the space bar and this option here where it says selected, so whatever selected in the viewport here will be affected by any of the commands in this section of here. So if I hit delete the selection, then it will delete that particular face from there. So now if I bring back the symmetry, now I've got a cleaner piece of geometry with no geometry bordering that symmetry line, which will cause me issues and further down the road. So always just double check in case you've got those in there, and we'll do that quite a few times during this process just to keep an eye on things and to keep the geometry nice and clean. So from this point, let's make a few more cuts onto here and prepare the base for the rest of the model. What I'm going to do is go to my top view here, enable the grid again, and go back to using the split rings tool. And what I want to do is create some kind of like a perimeter around the building, and it's going to be 1/2 meter again. So to do that, I'll zoom in and I'll use my grid as reference here. You can see, because I've got the grid snapping on, that the tool is snapping to those increments. So at this point, what I'll do is I'll go in and I will snap it, my first point to the 1/2 meter mark there. And on this side, zoom out, you can see my 1/2 meter mark there. It snaps to it. So I'll put another one right on there as well. And the last one I'll do is at the top, going across the top here. Making sure I'm snapping on. So now I've got something like this. And you see, because I've got the split rings tool activated, it's just putting a split line all the way around there. Let's remove the grid, just so it's a little bit more clear. One thing to note, that when you've got this virtual mirror on here, it's very important that you understand that this kind of option will only work if you have symmetry enabled. So this menu here, symmetry, and the view virtual mirror tool work hand in hand. So for example, I've got the mirror tool active on this one, but if I go to symmetry by hitting S on the keyboard and I turn symmetry off, even though the virtual mirror is on, it's not going to work if symmetry is not enabled. So sometimes you can wonder, you know, well, it's turned on here, why isn't it working? And it's because of that. And vice versa. Sometimes you can have the symmetry mode turned on and thinking, well, why isn't it symmetrical? And it's because this one's turned off. So they both work together, and it sometimes can be a bit of frustration because you don't understand why that one isn't activated. So to create the front of this object, I'll need my grid, so I'll activate the grid again and snap to my top view here. And essentially, this is the front of my building here. I want a kind of a tall structure at the front of the building, an entrance to it. And from the platform here that I've created, this 1/2 meter gap platform around the building, I want to go roughly 2.5 units in and place the sort of the end of my wall there. Again, I'll use the same tool for this, the split rings tool, and I'll make sure my measurements are correct and I'm roughly in the right place, which is roughly here. Zoom in on there and position my cursor there and snap it to that mark. So at that point I've got my sort of base of my wall, if you like, set. So change the tool, go back to my faces tool, and I'll just hide that grid again. What's going to be useful now is for me to have some kind of visual reference in terms of human scale as to how high I want this. So I'll snap to the front view, bring my grid back here so I can see the front, and I'll turn on my reference male object. So you can see there he is, and he's actually submerged in the platform of the model at the moment, which is no good. We want him actually to stand on here. So the way I've done this, and I explained this at the beginning, is I brought it in as a kind of like a sculpt reference hybrid object. So for me, what I have to do to move him in the right position is to literally go over to the sculpt room here, and this is where it gives me access to this character. You notice that my object, my modeling has now disappeared because I'm in a different room. You can see that with this object, the center point of him for the transform tool here has been set to roughly his midriff. So I need it at his feet. To do that, I will select Move Only Gizmo, and with the snapping enabled on the the grid, I'll just move that down to the base there. Okay, so now my gizmo is located at 0, 0 on the ground plane. To move him up now, make sure that the move only gizmo is unchecked, and I'll use the middle value here, which is X, Y, Z, the middle one here, and put a value in of 0.5 to move him up 0.5 of a meter. So now, with him in the right spot, I can now go back to the modeling room. My model appears again because I'm in the modeling environment, and you can see that he's now standing on top of the platform, which is exactly where he should be. So I want to create this front wall now, and I'll need to select this poly here, and I'll snap to the front view and show the grid. So how far do I want this polygon here to extend upwards? We'll select the select tool here, commit an extrusion, and snap so that this wall goes, so we can extend this wall up. So roughly here I've got 3 meters. I think that should be okay, and I may just take it up. Whoops. Yeah, well, that seems a good height there. So we'll just extend that wall up that high and apply that. Just escape the tool and deselect. So there's the first wall. Now this isn't going to be just a straight wall. I want it to actually taper at the top. So and at the same time I want to make some kind of doorway for our character to have walked through. So I'll make my first cut across here. Let's change the tool, go back to the split rings tool so I can see. Maybe that'll do there, just kind of like 2 meters. So I'll just put my cut here. That'll be my door, the top of the door there. It just gives him enough headroom. And the next one that I'll do, next thing I'll do rather, is I'll kind of bring and taper the top of this in. To do that, I'll select this top face here, select my transform tool, and just taper that in. Now you'll notice that when I do that, it splits the geometry, which is not what I want. So what I can do here is move the gizmo only to the center, and now with that snapped to the center point, uncheck move only gizmo, and now try that move again, and now it will taper from the center, and obviously the mirror action is now taking care of that split in the center. So it's just a small taper just on the top part of the object there. So let's apply that. Sorry, hit apply and deselect. I think what I'm going to do is actually put a platform on the top of this building just to make it a little bit more interesting. So I'll select this here, this top poly here. I'll use my select and transform, commit the extrusion, and I'll just snap up 0.5 meter on there. Let's deselect this one now. Select these polys around the edge, holding shift. And I'll go down here and I'll extrude these faces out by hitting the extrude faces. 2 ways I can do this now. I can either use this gizmo that appears, or I can use this method here by just hitting this little icon on the side there. Now, before you do it, you must use the commit extrusion, otherwise this happens where it just kind of pushes the selected faces out because that's what you told it to do. So make sure that before you do that, you commit an extrusion. Now, I don't want to use this gizmo. I'll commit the extrusion here, and I'll use this one this time, and I'll just pull that out like so. And that's just extruded those faces out. And it should be roughly half a meter. Or, let's double check that. If I put in 0.5 here, and then hit this one, then it extends it out. Okay, so we can either use this little dialog here and use these ones to push out or push in, or we can use this one again. You can see in a way that we've got these two arrows here, and they kind of collate to these two arrows here as to the function. But this gives you a little bit more control over the amount you're extruding. Let's apply that. Escape and Control D to deselect. And what I'll do is I'll select this poly again, and I'll just extrude this one up again. So go back to my select and transform and commit the extrusion first and snap that up twice to give me a kind of like a decoration on the top. Let's apply that. With this poly selected here, what I'll do now is I'll go to the inset tool, and I'll kind of create a kind of a bevel on this. There's different ways of doing it. Actually, probably a bevel would be better. So let's select an edge. Let's just deselect those first and just select these edges around here. And with those selected, I'll hit spacebar down to bevel, and I will choose the bevel size and just bevel that one something like that, and say OK. That's fine. And then I'll select this poly here, and maybe I'll kind of do an inset on this one. So I'll hit space on there, inset, and pull in those faces. So you can see here that I've got a bit of an issue on this one where it's insetting those on that side there. It's not a problem, and it gives me an opportunity to show you a different tool inside of here. So for now I'm going to commit to this, even though it's kind of wrong, but what I'm aiming for, just so you know, is to have a single polyline, a single area in here which I'm going to extrude down into the object. But let's make that mistake on purpose and say OK. Right, so here what I can do now is I've got this problem. I've got this area here, and it's called, and I need this to sort of flow right the way through. So what I'll do is I'll turn off the mirror by going to virtual mirror there, and we can see we've got a few more errors here where we've got these internal polys again. But let's take one step at a time. I'm going to deselect this one, and I want to get rid of this poly here. So I'm just going to delete it, and whilst I'm at it, let's delete this one, and that one. And there's one more down there. Let's delete those. Those are going to cause us problems, so let's just get rid of them. So here's the other thing that we can do. You can see now that we've got this kind of like problem area here. Now I can snap this on to snap this over to this line here if I want to, but what I'll do is I'll use a different tool, and let's deselect those, and I'll select this edge, this point and this point here, and then I'll select these points on the end here. It's best to actually disable the grid just for now because it's trying to snap. There we go. So I've got these 4 points selected, and if I scroll down here, there's an align vertices option down here. So if I click on that option, you'll see that I have this dialog that comes up, and essentially it's kind of analyzing the 4 vertices that I've selected here, and it's saying for an orthographic projection onto the x-axis, then when this alignment by minimum is checked, it's seeing which one's further away, and it's going to try and bring those inwards. So if I turn this one off, you'll see it's kind of like the opposite action. It considers these ones as the correct ones, and it will align these 2 vertices here to these ones. But we want these to snap to the center, so we'll check that and hit apply, and then it brings those vertices right to the end of there, which is exactly what I want. I'll say OK and just turn that tool off and escape. Let's try that one like so. So now all those vertices are aligned on there. So that mistake I made at the beginning was kind of been corrected now, and we've just learned a new tool along the way. So what I could do now is I'll go back and I'll just continue with what I was planning on doing here, which is just extruding this one down. So I'll hit the space bar and select and transform. Whoops, deselected by mistake. Let's try again. So this one here, let's move this out of the way, and now commit the extrusion and make sure, actually I won't make sure the grid snapping's on this one, I'll just sort of eyeball it and just bring that one down, something like that. Say apply, select, and you see it's giving me this extra face on there, so I can get rid of that. I don't want that because I want this to be a continual line all the way through. So just deselect that, and let's bring the symmetry back in now. The virtual mirror. Okay, so now I need to create the back part of this building. So it's going to be kind of like a forecourt area around here where he's standing in. So I'll snap to the front view, I think, bring my grid back, and I'll roughly put the height of the wall at the back here. So I'm using this grid as the measurement. I'll use the split rings tool, and I'll put the height roughly, so I'm kind of looking at my reference here, and I'm just trying to figure out how tall this wall will be. And I think I'll go with something like this here. So I'll just move in and position and put a split line roughly there. Okay, so let's turn off this back grid just for a moment. I don't really need that there. It's getting in my way. So I'll turn that one off, and maybe I'll turn that one on. So now I can see roughly where this wall is going to go. So I'll go over to here, and I want this wall to be roughly 1/2 meter again. Here, so I'll start. Let's do this. Let's go over to here, and from this one here, I'll go in 1/2 meter. So I'll choose this point here and go 0.5 meter along this wall here, and then I'll put another split in here, another 0.5 meter going on this one. So snap this one there. Okay, so this poly here, switch over to poly, deselect those. This poly here is going to be the wall. So you can see that now this is going to be kind of like ground area, these two here, and this perimeter that I had discussed before is kind of like a ground perimeter, I suppose. Oh, and we also need to do obviously a back wall as well, so let's do a couple of splits along here. This one can just be 0.5 meter across, so again I'll jump back to that splits tool and put my split there, and I'll put another one here. Okay. Yeah, sometimes you get those. I was just worried there because I just noticed that it wasn't cut, but actually it was. So yep, that's fine. That's fine. That gives me what I'm after. So let's extrude these faces here. So let me go over to select faces, and I'll take this one and this one, deselect this one. Don't need it there. And I'm going to extrude these ones out, but I'm going to end up with the same problem I had before because I've got these polys here, which it's going to extrude over this poly, and I don't want that. So let's deselect. Let's take this poly here and just delete it. And yeah, and I think actually I'll just, yeah, that should be okay for now. Let's go back to our polys, deselect. Select these two here, use my tool again here, commit an extrusion, and I'm going to bring this wall all the way over to here. So it kind of fills the area that I've just deleted, that polygon that I've just deleted there. Something like that. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll just put a split, so I can do two things. I can either delete this one, which I think I will. Let's just deselect those, and I'm going to just take this poly and delete it, and then I'll take, deselect those, take these two, and I'll just do another extrusion and snap this one, oops, too far, to that one there. Okay, and then at this point I'll just deselect, and all I'm going to do now is just bring these ones over. So I'll bring these ones over in the same way and snap them to the center here. Again, I need to get rid of this one here just to make sure I don't get any issues. So let's deselect, select this one, hit delete. That clears that out for me. Select this one here, and my extrusion tool, commit an extrusion, and move across something like that. Let's deselect those. So this grid is getting in my way a little bit, so I'll just hide that. Select these two here and delete. I don't need those two polys anymore. And instead what I'm going to do now is kind of bring these two edges together so that they meet in the center here. Now you'll notice down at the bottom here I do have some extra polys on there, on that face down there. It's not really a problem. These ones I'm talking about down there. Let's deselect that. Okay, so let's choose the points and just go in here. I'll just use the select tool because that gizmo is going to get in my way. Keeps popping up. Let's choose this one, this one, this one, and this one. All right, so I need to bring these in line here first of all. So we know how to do that now because we've used this tool before. So we'll go down to our align vertices, and it's already guessed which ones we want. So these are the correct ones, and it's understanding, shall I move these 4 points here in line with those top ones, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to apply that, which straightens that out there, and now I can just go over to the select tool. So with those edges selected there, I'll use the gizmo here using select transform, and I'll just move those in. So the mirror tool actually at this point will just take over because it won't let me go beyond there. Even though I'm extending beyond, the mirror tool is just saying that's where we meet and that's where we'll stop. So I'll just bring it to this point here and that'll be okay. Any overlap is not really a problem. Alright, so those have been created there, that's fine. So what we'll do now is we will just take a look, and what's next to do, we'll create the doorway next on here properly. So I'll go to the front view here and use my grid again. I'll need the other grid plane visible. So let's go over to turn the YZ one off and turn on the XY. Just so I've got some sort of measurement here. And then I'll go over to my split tool again. And I'll place a single cut down here. It's a pretty narrow doorway, but there we go. So there's my doorway, and now I'll just remove the polys. So at this point I think the virtual mirror is kind of getting in the way a little bit, so I'm going to turn that off. Okay, and let's turn off that grid as well. It's getting in the way. And what I can do here is go to my select, poly, and select those two faces there, and delete those. Okay, and I'll use a different tool now, and I'll go over to the quads tool, and I'll make sure I've got either direct or parallel here selected. I'll click on this edge here, spin the viewport around and snap it to this edge there and create a quad across there. So whenever you're using the quads tool, let's just undo that. If I've select with the quads tool active here, it's kind of saying which edge do you want me to start with. So it's this one, and you can see here's a preview of the quad it's going to make, and then it wants you to snap it to another one. But because this is a back-facing poly here, this section, it's not recognizing it. That's why I hold Alt down on the keyboard, left mouse button, rotate the view round, and now 3D-Coat recognizes that's a quad and a legitimate edge it can snap to, and then I left click on there to snap it. So let's repeat that on this one. I click Alt, rotate the view round, and just make sure I'm there, and then snap it to there so we know I've got a good snap onto that face. And try one more time. This one I don't need to because both normals are facing upwards, so it's easy for me to snap that one. So that gives me that doorway there. Now I could at this point decide to put another doorway in, so a kind of a passageway in here, which is what I'll try and do now. So I'll select this option here, faces, mode there, and let's try to create something a little bit different. Well, there's a couple of ways I can do this actually. I could make an inset into here, but what I will do is just deselect that and go back to my favorite tool, which is the split rings, and it's a little bit easier for me to do it this way. So I won't use the grid or the snapping on this. I'll just sort of eyeball a kind of a rough passageway in here. So I'll put one there and one there, something like that. Then I'll select this tool, select that face, hit select transform, commit an extrusion. So if you find that it's not moving, it's sometimes the symmetry option is on. So for example here, I've got symmetry on, and when this happens, you need to just make sure that your symmetry is actually turned off. Let's just undo a couple of times there. Go to symmetry and just make sure that's turned off, and then try it again, and you should have that working as it should do. So let's just commit an extrusion there and pull this chamber out there, something like that. And again, let's just drop that face there, take this one and do the same thing. And let's say there's a kind of a secret passage up here inside there. So let's drop that tool again and bring back the virtual mirror on there. Oh, make sure symmetry is on. There we go. So now I've got a doorway with an internal area inside that main front wall. And you can see that sort of cavity space there. So continuing on, we just need to do a little bit of cleanup now on this model. So let's remove the virtual mirror on here, and let's turn off our symmetry as well. S on the keyboard. Now you can see there's a problem down here where the doorway that we created with the split loops tool created a piece of geometry across here which isn't continuing it up through the wall. It's not a huge problem, but maybe it will cause us a bit of an issue. So let's try and correct that. Select the Faces tool. And let's start by just deleting this object because it's not really needed and it's only going to cause us some problems. Let's do the same here as well for those two faces there underneath. Again, you don't really need to do that, it's just making it a little bit cleaner. Right, the next thing we need to do here is in this case, is just to bring this line here, the split here, up the wall, over the top, and round the back. So here I'm going to select these faces here. And what I'll do is select the grid again. And with the faces selected, I'm just going to use my split tool here. You can see it's trying to snap to that point because I put it roughly at the 1/2 meter mark when I was making the doorway. So I'll just use that there. So you can see it put that split down, but I wasn't too accurate with it. You can see I'm quite a distance off, so it's no problem. And I'll do the same here, just deselect those faces here, and I'll run a split over here as well. Something like this. Now, you can see there that we've got a problem. These edges don't add up, don't line up. So let's correct that issue now. So depending on which one you think is right, and I've got more confidence in this line here, these two lines here, than I have in this split. So this one and this one I know are pretty solid in terms of measurements, whereas this one and these ones probably aren't. So I'll go with these as the correct lines to follow. And let's change the tool now and go to slide edges. Make sure edge loop is selected here, and I'll slide this edge across. Now you might need to make sure that your grid snapping is off on this, which will give you a little bit more flexibility there. So let's zoom in and see if we can line this up a little bit better. Something like that. It should be pretty much spot on that side too. It's a little bit off, but that's okay. Now you may notice here that we've got a little bit of an offset here. I did that on purpose before because the mirroring will take care of that when we merge all this together. So I'm not too worried about that at the moment. But what I have got to do here is kind of weld these points together because nothing's actually solid geometry at the moment. So let's tackle that problem by going to the points tool here. I know that all this stuff here is welded nicely, but if I go to spacebar move with the points selected, you can see here that now I can sort of move these independently, and sure enough they are not welded together. So what I'll do is I'll select one of these, like this one, and if I just move it over there, let's do this a little bit more accurately. So if I take this one here and place it next to the other one using the move tool, it becomes actually welded. Now I know, as I said, that this area here is correct. This one was the problem. But now what I've done is I've actually welded those two together. So let's check this one and make sure this is welded. You can see there's a split here as well. So I'll go over to that one and see if I can just weld that one. So now when I moved it over, it actually automatically welded that point there. So all these here, when I did that last move, would cause me issues because they weren't actually welded geometry. So that's something to look out for when you're doing this. And the way to check is obviously, as I'm doing here with the move tool and the points tool selected, if the geometry is moving as one and all these verts and edges are connected, you're going to be able to move the geometry around like this. Let's check this one. that's fine. And that's fine as well. I know that these are all welded together, and this one should be welded. This one isn't welded here. It's not, like I said, it's not too much of an issue, this one isn't, because the mirror tool will take care of that. So you can see here I've got this problem again on this side, probably all the way around. So here I'll select the one on the wall, the vert on the wall, and snap it to the one on the floor, and now they're welded together. Let's go to the corner. See, there's an issue there, so let's just weld those together. Now they're welded. And let's just double check this side, and that's fine, that's all welded. Maybe these. Yep, that's fine. So all these have been welded, and that's fine. So we had that issue there, but that seems to have been corrected now. That's not too bad. And what I want to do is make a kind of a canopy in this back space of this temple object. I'll choose the split rings tool, and I'll just eyeball in an area here that's going to be the roof. So let's choose something like that. With that done, I'll change over to the faces mode and just select the new geometry that I've just cut. So I'm holding shift down and selecting those faces. So I'll jump over now to the Smart Extrude option here, and I'll double click on all those selected faces, and then I can start to extrude that out and move it around. So I'm going to use the right mouse button here and pull these inwards like so, and I can snap this view to the side here and left mouse button and kind of pull them down a little bit like that. So we've got our same issue here that we had before, that it's kind of pulled those in. We know how to correct that. So let's say that's okay and that's done. I'll just escape the tool here and deselect those polys like so, and I'll delete these two faces that have been created on the edge, on the ends here, like so. Alright, so that's quite easily fixable, this little problem that we've got again here. We'll go to edges mode, point mode, and snap to that view. Let's go down to our align vertices, and again it knows which ones to do. We'll just say apply. That's fine. And hit escape and deselect. Like so. I've got that weird thing there where this edge here is moving over. So let's correct that problem. So let's choose edges and select. I'm just moving the brush size down here. Select that edge there and that edge there. With those two selected, I'll select the move tool here and just move those. Snap to that view there. Just kind of straighten those two up there. And final thing will be to just hit S on the keyboard and go over to mesh, and now we can see our kind of object like so. Now it's still only half an object, so the very last thing to do before we move on is to merge this all together. I'll just save this very quickly and we'll go over to mesh, and it says here apply symmetry to current layer. So I'll hit that option, and it doesn't look as if anything's happened. It's because it's still trying to mirror it as well. If I turn that one off, then you can see that that geometry now has all been merged together, and the issues that I was talking about down here with that overlapping piece of geometry is now kind of fixed itself, because 3D-Coat has gone ahead and just merged those two and averaged them out to the center point. Okay, so my building now is pretty much done. Because this video has been quite a long one, I'll leave it there, and we're going to do a little bit more in the next video, just to put a little bit more detailing on the front of this building, and then we're going to UV map it, and then do some texture painting on there, and then we'll take it into Blender and do some renders of it. But that's it for this one. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next video.